Marcus Vale stared at the assignment briefing on his datapad and wondered which enemy he'd made in the engineering corps to deserve what could only be described as professional suicide by alien technology. The holographic display showed him images of Queen Thyravel's ceremonial armor, a masterpiece of Drakmoran craftsmanship that looked like someone had convinced liquid starlight to hold the shape of battle gear, while maintaining the artistic sensibilities of a Renaissance sculptor having fever dreams. "You want me to fix that?" he said to Commander Hayes, who had the decency to look uncomfortable while delivering what amounted to a career death sentence. "The Queen specifically requested a human engineer," Hayes replied, shuffling through his own files with the enthusiasm of someone handling radioactive waste. "Apparently, 7 of the galaxy's most renowned quantumsmiths have already tried and failed. One of them is still undergoing treatment for temporary consciousness displacement." Meaning? He spent 3 days believing he was a particularly philosophical houseplant. Full recovery, but his insurance premiums went through the roof. Marcus examined the technical specifications again, trying to make sense of measurements that included emotional resonance frequencies and consciousness compatibility matrices. The armor wasn't just protective equipment, it was a living extension of its wearer, forged from materials that existed in quantum superposition until activated by Royal Drakmoran biorhythms. "Sir, with all due respect, I specialize in human technology. My greatest achievement to date was designing a coffee machine that works in zero gravity without creating floating spheres of caffeinated death." "Which is exactly why you might succeed where others have failed," Hayes said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Marcus. "The Drakmoran approach to technology is based on consciousness integration and emotional resonance. Human engineering, on the other hand, is based on stubbornness, duct tape, and making things work despite all logical reasons they shouldn't. I was going to say practical innovation and adaptive problem solving, but your version is probably more accurate." Marcus scrolled through the damage assessment reports, each one more discouraging than the last. The armor's consciousness bonding matrices had been severed, the quantum-stabilized metal showed signs of trauma-induced crystalline fractures, and the power distribution network had apparently developed what could only be described as depression. "How does metal get depressed?" he asked. "Drakmoran armor is grown, not forged. It's essentially a living organism with metallic biology. When the bonding connection was severed, the armor experienced what their xenopsychologists are calling existential grief. So I'm not just an engineer on this assignment, I'm a therapist for sentient metal. The compensation package includes hazard pay and full psychological coverage for both you and any equipment that achieves consciousness during the repair process." Marcus considered his options. Accept the assignment and probably fail spectacularly in front of galactic dignitaries, or decline and spend the rest of his career maintaining atmospheric processors on mining platforms where the most complex engineering challenge involved making sure the air recyclers didn't develop personality disorders. "When do I leave?" he asked. The journey to the Drakmoran homeworld took 3 weeks and gave Marcus plenty of time to study everything known about their technology, which turned out to be considerably less than everything needed to understand it. Drakmoran engineering operated on principles that made quantum mechanics look straightforward and required the kind of intuitive grasp of consciousness-matter interactions that humans had never developed, mostly because human consciousness was apparently too chaotic to achieve stable integration with advanced technology. The Drakmoran capital city of Velkathari existed in a state of controlled architectural evolution, with buildings that grew and adapted based on the emotional needs of their inhabitants. Marcus's transport descended through layers of crystalline spires that sang harmonic welcomes in frequencies that made his bones vibrate, past gardens where the plants were apparently engaged in philosophical discussions with the landscaping, and finally landed at the Royal Engineering Complex, where he would either make history or become a cautionary tale told at engineering conferences. Ambassador Vale greeted Chief Engineer Korthves, whose elongated skull plates marked her as a member of the Drakmoran technical caste. "We are curious to observe human repair methodologies." The diplomatic phrasing couldn't quite hide what Marcus interpreted as polite skepticism mixed with desperate hope. He followed her through corridors lined with murals that moved to accommodate the viewer's perspective, past laboratories where technicians worked with tools that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and into a workshop that looked like someone had built a cathedral for the worship of impossible machinery. And there, displayed on a stand that seemed to be made of crystallized time, was Queen Thyravel's armor. Marcus had seen the technical specifications, but nothing had prepared him for the actual presence of the damaged artifact. The armor held the elegant proportions of classical sculpture, while incorporating technological elements that hurt to look at directly. Where it should have been whole, fractured lines ran through the quantum-stabilized metal like frozen lightning, and the consciousness-bonding matrices hung in the air around the breastplate like severed neural pathways made visible. "The damage assessment reports don't capture the full scope of the problem," Marcus said, walking slowly around the display. "Indeed, the trauma extends beyond the physical structure. The armor's consciousness has withdrawn into protective dormancy. It will not respond to our repair attempts because it no longer trusts the bonding process." Marcus reached toward one of the fractured sections, then stopped as the metal actually flinched away from his touch. "It's afraid." Fear is not an emotion we typically associate with battle armor. Maybe that's part of the problem. Marcus stepped back and studied the damage patterns more carefully. "You've been trying to repair this like it's broken machinery, but it's not machinery. It's a traumatized being who happens to be made of metal." Korthves's head plates shifted in what Marcus was learning to recognize as confusion. "Your approach would be, first, I need to understand what happened. The real story, not the diplomatic version. Then I need to figure out how to convince a paranoid suit of armor that it's safe to trust again." The Queen was reluctant to discuss details. "Then I'll need to talk to the Queen." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Marcus to wonder if he just committed some form of cultural blasphemy, but Korthves eventually nodded. "I will make the arrangements, though I should warn you, Her Majesty has been differently disposed since the incident. She spends much time in the memorial gardens, communing with the memories preserved in the Royal Consciousness Archives." "Grieving," Marcus translated. "We do not use that term for royalty. But that's what she's doing." "Yes." Marcus looked at the damaged armor again, noting how the fracture patterns seemed almost organic, not like metal had been broken, but like living tissue had been wounded. "The armor isn't the only one who needs healing, is it? You are perceptive for a being whose consciousness generates so much neural static that our empathic sensors register you as a blank space in reality." "I'm going to take that as a compliment." It was intended as one. Marcus spent his first 3 days studying the armor like it was a patient in intensive care, rather than a broken piece of equipment, much to the bewilderment of the Drakmoran engineering staff, who kept expecting him to start taking measurements or calibrating quantum resonance chambers. Instead, he pulled up a chair, sat next to the display stand, and simply observed. "What exactly are you doing?" asked Junior Engineer Thekmer, whose youth was apparent in both his barely developed head plates and his inability to hide his confusion. "Getting to know the patient," Marcus replied, making notes on his datapad about how the armor's luminescence patterns shifted in response to different emotional stimuli in the workshop. "See how the chest plate dims when people argue near it, and watch what happens to the shoulder guards when someone laughs." Sure enough, a burst of laughter from across the workshop caused subtle ripples of light to cascade across the armor's surface, like it was remembering what joy felt like. "You're treating it as if it has feelings." "Because it does. Your technical specifications describe consciousness bonding matrices, emotional resonance chambers, and trauma response protocols. That's not equipment terminology, that's psychology. Marcus had spent the previous evening reviewing everything he could find about the incident that damaged the armor. The official reports were diplomatically vague, but reading between the lines painted a picture of an assassination attempt during a formal ceremony, with Queen Thyravel's bonded partner taking a quantum disruptor blast meant for her. The armor had tried to extend its protective field to cover both of them, but the disruption had severed the consciousness connections, leaving both the armor and the Queen experiencing what could only be described as survivor's guilt combined with phantom limb syndrome on a psychological level. "I need to try something," Marcus announced, pulling out his personal music player, a device that looked primitive by Drakmoran standards but had gotten him through countless late-night engineering sessions. Fair warning, this might seem weird. He activated the player and selected one of his favorite jazz compositions, something with enough complexity to be interesting, but enough harmony to be soothing. The music filled the workshop through his portable speakers, and the reaction from the armor was immediate and startling. The fracture lines began to pulse with soft light, keeping time with the rhythm. "Fascinating," breathed Korthves, appearing at Marcus's shoulder with the silent movement that all Drakmoran engineers seemed to master. "The resonance frequencies are triggering responses in the dormant consciousness matrices." "Music is mathematical," Marcus explained, adjusting the volume as the armor's luminescence grew brighter. "But it's also emotional. If the armor's consciousness is wounded, maybe we can reach it through art instead of technology." What followed was 3 weeks of the strangest engineering project Marcus had ever undertaken. Each morning, he would arrive at the workshop, set up his equipment, and spend hours playing different types of music while monitoring the armor's responses. Classical compositions made the quantum-stabilized metal sing in harmonics that shouldn't have been possible. Electronic music caused the consciousness-bonding matrices to pulse with complex patterns. But it was the jazz, improvisational, chaotic human jazz, that seemed to reach deepest into whatever passed for the armor's soul. "You realize," said Thekmer during the second week, "that you're essentially providing psychotherapy to battle gear." "I'm providing psychotherapy to a traumatized consciousness that happens to be housed in battle gear," Marcus corrected, making fine adjustments to a quantum resonance calibrator, while Ella Fitzgerald's voice filled the workshop. "There's a difference." The armor had begun responding to Marcus's presence, its luminescence brightening when he entered the workshop and dimming noticeably when he left for the day. More intriguingly, it had started exhibiting what could only be described as preferences. Certain types of music would cause excited flickers, while others resulted in what appeared to be metallic sulking. "I think it likes bebop," Marcus announced after a particularly enthusiastic response to a Charlie Parker recording. "Either that, or it's trying to achieve quantum resonance with the saxophone solo." "Both possibilities are equally plausible," Korthves observed. "The consciousness appears to be developing new response patterns. This is unprecedented." The breakthrough came during the third week when Marcus, frustrated by a particularly stubborn consciousness matrix that refused to accept his calibration attempts, muttered a string of colorful profanity that would have made his old drill sergeant proud. The armor's response was immediate and unmistakable. It laughed. The sound was like silver bells having a conversation with crystal chimes, harmonic and impossible and definitely expressing amusement at Marcus's linguistic creativity. Every engineer in the workshop stopped what they were doing and stared. "Did the armor just—" Thekmer began. "Laugh at me? Yeah, I think it did." Marcus looked at the breastplate, which was now pulsing with what could only be described as mirth. "You think that's funny, do you? Well, let's see how you handle this." He launched into an explanation of human engineering principles that included generous amounts of technical profanity, creative descriptions of stubborn machinery, and a detailed account of his ongoing relationship with a coffee machine that had developed what he was convinced was a malicious personality. The armor's luminescence grew brighter with each colorful metaphor, until it was practically glowing with what appeared to be delighted appreciation for Marcus's unique approach to technical difficulties. "I believe," Korthves said carefully, "that you have achieved emotional resonance with the consciousness matrix. Great, now what? Now we discover if it trusts you enough to allow actual repair attempts." Marcus approached the display stand slowly, his hands open and empty. The armor's luminescence shifted to curious anticipation as he reached toward the most damaged consciousness-bonding matrix. When his fingers made contact with the quantum-stabilized metal, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, he could feel the armor's consciousness directly, a vast and ancient awareness that had been lonely and afraid, and was now desperately grateful for contact with a mind that didn't try to fix it so much as understand it. The connection lasted only seconds before Marcus stumbled backward, gasping with the intensity of the experience. But in those brief moments, he had felt everything the armor felt: the trauma of the attack, the guilt of being unable to protect both bonded partners, the fear of ever risking that kind of pain again, and underneath it all, a desperate desire to fulfill its purpose while keeping everyone safe. "Well," Marcus said, sitting down heavily and wondering if his insurance covered consciousness expansion experiences, "I think I know what needs to be fixed, and it's not just the technical systems." The armor pulsed with gentle acknowledgement, its luminescence settling into warm, hopeful patterns that filled the workshop with something that felt remarkably like trust. The real work began once Marcus understood that he wasn't just repairing armor. He was performing surgery on a traumatized consciousness that happened to be made of quantum-stabilized metal and crystallized emotion. Each damaged matrix required not just technical restoration but psychological healing, a process that proved to be far more complex than any engineering manual had ever prepared him for. "The consciousness bonding pathways are like neural networks," Marcus explained to Korthves, while carefully realigning quantum resonance crystals that had been shattered during the attack. When they were severed, it created the equivalent of phantom pain. The armor keeps trying to reach for connections that aren't there anymore. And your solution? Build new pathways, different ones but functional. Like physical therapy for the soul. The process required Marcus to maintain almost constant contact with the armor's consciousness, a connection that proved both exhausting and oddly intimate. During the deeper repair sessions, he could feel the armor's memories, centuries of battles, formal ceremonies, quiet moments in the royal chambers, and always the overwhelming love and protective instinct it felt toward its bonded wearer. It was during one of these sessions that Queen Thyravel first appeared in the workshop. Marcus was elbow-deep in a consciousness matrix, his hands literally inside a dimensional fold that existed within the armor's chest plate, when he became aware of someone watching him with unusual intensity. He looked up to find himself meeting the gaze of the most beautiful being he had ever seen. Tall, elegant, with the distinctive Drachmoran features that suggested both strength and grace, and eyes that held depths of intelligence, sorrow, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Your Majesty," he said, quickly extracting his hands from the dimensional fold and attempting something that might pass for a bow despite being covered in quantum lubricant and wearing work clothes that had seen better decades. "Continue your work," Queen Thyravel said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the workshop's crystalline surfaces ring in sympathy. "I did not come to interrupt but to observe." "The matrix recalibration is at a delicate stage," Marcus said, returning to his work while acutely aware of her presence. "The consciousness pathways are starting to accept the new connection protocols, but they're still fragile." "You speak of my armor as if it lives, because it does." Marcus made a careful adjustment to a resonance crystal, and the armor responded with a pulse of contentment that filled the workshop with warm light. "It has memories, preferences, emotional responses." The attack didn't just damage its technical systems, it traumatized a living consciousness. Queen Thyravel moved closer, and Marcus caught the subtle scent of something like starlight and ozone that seemed to be her natural fragrance. Others have attempted repairs. They treated it as machinery. That's why they failed. You can't fix trauma with calibration tools and replacement parts. You need patience, understanding, and... Marcus paused, realizing he was about to say something that might be completely inappropriate. Love. You need to approach it with love. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Marcus to wonder if he had committed some terrible cultural transgression. But when he looked up, the Queen's expression was one of wonder rather than offense. Love, she repeated softly. The armor loves you, Marcus explained, feeling heat rise to his cheeks but pressing on anyway. It's not just programmed to protect you, it genuinely cares about your welfare. The trauma it experienced wasn't just system damage, it was grief. It watched something terrible happen to someone it loved, and it blamed itself for not being able to prevent it. Queen Thyravel's breathing caught, and Marcus realized he was probably the first person to articulate what she had been feeling but couldn't express. You understand. I understand that healing requires acknowledging the pain, not just covering it up. She began visiting the workshop daily after that, initially claiming to monitor the repair progress but increasingly staying to watch Marcus work. Her presence seemed to accelerate the armor's healing process. The consciousness matrices grew stronger when both Marcus and the Queen were present, as if the armor was drawing strength from their combined attention. "Tell me about human engineering," she said one afternoon, settling gracefully onto a stool beside his workbench while he calibrated emotional resonance chambers. "It's mostly about solving problems with whatever you have available," Marcus replied, using a tool that was technically designed for quantum molecular alignment to tighten a bolt that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. "We call it making do, and if what you have available is inadequate, then you get creative. I once fixed a life support system with dental floss and a personal music player. That should not be possible. That's what makes it fun." Queen Thyravel's laugh was like music, harmonic and warm and filled with genuine amusement. The armor responded to the sound by brightening noticeably, its luminescence taking on joyful qualities that Marcus hadn't seen before. "It likes hearing you laugh," he observed. "I had not laughed in many cycles," she admitted. "Since the attack, joy has seemed inappropriate. Grief doesn't mean you can never be happy again. It means you carry the love forward while still living your life." The words hung between them, and Marcus realized he was having the kind of deep, personal conversation with alien royalty that definitely wasn't covered in his diplomatic training. But Queen Thyravel nodded as if he had said something profoundly meaningful. "Your approach to healing includes yourself as well as my armor. Maybe we're all a little damaged and in need of repair." As the weeks passed, their conversations grew longer and more personal. Marcus learned about Drakmoran culture, where consciousness bonding was considered the deepest form of intimacy, creating connections that transcended individual identity. Queen Thyravel learned about human resilience, the ability to find hope and humor even in the darkest circumstances, and the strange comfort of working with one's hands to fix broken things. The breakthrough came when Marcus successfully restored the primary consciousness bonding matrix, but the process created an unexpected side effect. As the armor's consciousness fully awakened and reached out to reconnect with its bonded partner, it encountered Marcus's presence in the quantum pathways, and, apparently deciding that anyone who had spent so much time and care on its healing must be part of the family, included him in the bonding network. The sensation was overwhelming. Suddenly Marcus could feel both the armor's consciousness and Queen Thyravel's emotional state, a three-way connection that linked human, Drakmoran, and sentient metal in ways that shouldn't have been possible but felt completely natural. "This is unprecedented," Queen Thyravel said, her voice filled with wonder as she experienced Marcus's thoughts and emotions through the armor's enhanced connection. "Is it a problem?" Marcus asked, though through the link he could already sense that her primary emotion was not concern, but something much warmer and more complex. "It is perfect," she replied, and the armor pulsed with contentment that encompassed all three consciousnesses in its protective embrace. Marcus realized that somewhere between repairing traumatized metal and providing therapy to alien royalty, he had become part of something larger and more meaningful than any engineering project he had ever undertaken. And through the quantum consciousness link, he could feel that Queen Thyravel felt exactly the same way. The grand hall of the Drakmoran royal palace had been designed to showcase power, beauty, and the technological mastery of a civilization that had perfected the art of making impossible things seem effortless. Today, it served as the stage for what everyone present understood to be far more than a simple presentation ceremony. Ambassadors from dozen worlds, master craftsmen from across the galaxy, and the entire Drakmoran nobility filled the crystalline amphitheater, all gathered to witness the unveiling of Queen Thyravel's restored ceremonial armor. Marcus stood in what he hoped was an appropriately inconspicuous location, near the Master Engineer's section, wearing his best dress uniform, and trying not to think about how many different ways this moment could go catastrophically wrong. The consciousness link he now shared with both the Queen and her armor made him acutely aware of every emotion in the hall: anticipation, curiosity, skepticism, and from somewhere in the royal section, a current of nervousness that could only be coming from Queen Thyravel herself. "Relax," he subvocalized, knowing the quantum connection would carry his thoughts to her. "The armor's functioning perfectly. All diagnostic readings are optimal, the consciousness matrices are stable, and it's practically glowing with pride about how good it looks." Through the link, he felt her amusement mixed with gratitude. "It is not the armor's performance I am concerned about." "Then what?" "The cultural implications of what we are about to reveal." Before Marcus could ask for clarification, the ceremonial music began, harmonic compositions that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and made the hall's crystalline architecture ring with sympathetic vibrations. Queen Thyravel emerged from the royal chambers, and the sight took Marcus's breath away. The restored armor was magnificent, but seeing it worn by its intended wearer elevated it from masterwork to something approaching divine artistry. Every line flowed perfectly with Queen Thyravel's form, the quantum-stabilized metal seeming to breathe with her movements. The consciousness-bonding matrices pulsed with gentle light that synchronized with her heartbeat, creating patterns of luminescence that were both protective technology and living art. But it was the change in Queen Thyravel herself that truly captured the hall's attention. The sorrow and withdrawal that had marked her presence since the attack were gone, replaced by a confidence and vitality that radiated through both her bearing and the armor's responsive glow. She moved like someone who had remembered what it felt like to be whole. "Honored guests," Queen Thyravel's voice carried perfectly through the hall's acoustic enhancement systems, reaching every being present with crystal clarity. "We gather today not merely to display restored armor, but to celebrate the power of healing, understanding, and the connections that transcend the boundaries between species." The crowd stirred with anticipation. Diplomatic presentations were usually formal affairs focused on technical specifications and political alliances, but something in the Queen's tone suggested this would be different. "Many master craftsmen attempted to repair this armor," she continued, the ceremonial garment responding to her words with subtle shifts in luminescence that emphasized each point. "Quantumsmiths whose skill spanned centuries, consciousness engineers whose understanding of bonding matrices exceeds our own, artists whose work has shaped the aesthetic of entire civilizations." Marcus felt a growing sense of unease through their shared connection. This sounded remarkably like the setup for public humiliation. "All failed," Queen Thyravel declared, and the hall fell completely silent. "They failed because they approached the task as technicians rather than healers." They saw broken machinery where they should have seen wounded consciousness. They offered calibration where they should have provided compassion. She turned toward the master engineers section, her gaze scanning the crowd until it found Marcus with unerring precision. Only the human engineer repaired this armor. The words carried across the hall with finality that made several diplomatic delegations straighten in their seats. Marcus felt every eye in the enormous space turn toward him, accompanied by a collective intake of breath that suggested everyone present understood implications that he was still trying to grasp. Queen Thyravel's gaze locked onto his, and through their quantum connection, Marcus felt the full weight of what she was communicating. In Drakmoran culture, allowing someone to repair royal armor, to touch the most intimate extension of a ruler's consciousness, was an act of trust reserved for the deepest bonds. It was equivalent to opening one's soul to another being, accepting them not just as craftsmen but as partner. The consciousness bonding protocols have been restored beyond their original specifications, Queen Thyravel continued, her voice carrying new harmonics that made the armor's luminescence shift to warmer, more personal frequencies. The armor now responds not only to royal consciousness patterns, but to those of the one who healed its traumatized matrices. The gasps from the assembled crowd were audible even through the hall's dampening fields. Marcus realized that Queen Thyravel wasn't just acknowledging his technical achievement. She was publicly declaring their connection in terms that every Drakmoran present would understand as a formal bonding announcement. "This is unprecedented," whispered someone in the engineering section. "This is revolutionary," breathed another voice. Through the quantum link, Marcus felt Queen Thyravel's emotional state, nervous but determined, vulnerable but confident in her choice. She was taking an enormous risk by publicly acknowledging their bond, challenging centuries of tradition, and opening herself to criticism from those who might question her choice of a human partner. But as Marcus looked around the hall, he saw not disapproval but wonder. The diplomatic delegations were rapidly recalculating political equations. The master craftsmen were studying him with new respect mixed with curiosity about his methods. And the Drakmoran nobles were displaying the kind of electromagnetic patterns that indicated excitement about witnessing a historic moment. "The armor's consciousness has accepted this dual bonding," Queen Thyravel announced, raising her hand to display the consciousness bonding matrix at her wrist, which pulsed with patterns that somehow included both her own biorhythms and Marcus's human neural signatures. "It recognizes the human engineer not as outsider, but as partner in the protection of this realm." The formal presentation continued with technical demonstrations that showcased the armor's enhanced capabilities, but Marcus was only peripherally aware of the proceedings. Through their connection, he could feel Queen Thyravel's consciousness intertwined with his own, mediated by the armor's artificial intelligence that had somehow decided to adopt them both. When the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Marcus found himself approached by a stream of beings wanting to understand his repair techniques, offer him positions with their own governments, or simply satisfy their curiosity about the human who had achieved what master craftsmen had considered impossible. "How did you know it would work?" asked Master Engineer Thekvel, whose reputation spanned several star systems. "I didn't," Marcus replied honestly. "I just treated the armor like a patient instead of a machine and listened to what it was trying to tell me." "And the consciousness bonding, was that intentional?" Marcus glanced toward Queen Thyravel, who was gracefully handling her own crowd of well-wishers and political allies. Through their link, he felt her amusement at his diplomatic predicament. "Sometimes," he said, "the best engineering happens when you stop trying to control the outcome and start working with what wants to happen naturally." Later, when the last diplomatic delegations had departed, and the grand hall had returned to its usual crystalline silence, Marcus found himself alone with Queen Thyravel in the workshop where everything had begun. The armor rested on its display stand, no longer damaged but transformed, stronger, more responsive, and somehow more alive than it had ever been before. "Do you understand what happened today?" Queen Thyrevel asked, settling beside him on the bench where they had spent so many hours in conversation. "I think so," Marcus replied, though through their connection he could sense that his understanding was still incomplete. "By allowing me to repair your armor, you essentially declared that you trust me with the most intimate aspects of your consciousness. And by accepting the dual bonding, you've made me part of something that goes beyond professional relationship. In Drakmoran culture, consciousness bonding is the deepest form of commitment. It creates connections that transcend individual identity, sharing not just thoughts and emotions but the very essence of being." Marcus felt the truth of her words through their quantum link. He could sense her presence as a constant, warm companion in his thoughts, while the armor's artificial intelligence served as both bridge and protector for their unprecedented interspecies connection. "And I somehow achieved this by being too stubborn to give up on a traumatized suit of armor." Queen Thyrevel's laugh filled the workshop with harmonics that made the crystalline surfaces sing. "You achieved this by seeing need and responding with compassion, by treating healing as more important than protocol, and by demonstrating that the most profound connections often develop when we focus on understanding rather than impressing." The armor pulsed with contentment, its luminescence creating patterns that somehow managed to convey approval, gratitude, and what could only be described as familial affection for both of its bonded partners. "So, what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we discover what it means when a human engineer and a Drakmoran queen share consciousness through quantum-bonded armor, and how that partnership might change both our worlds." Through their connection, Marcus felt the depth of possibility stretching before them. Technical collaboration that could revolutionize both human and Drakmoran engineering, cultural exchange that might bridge species barriers thought insurmountable, and personal discoveries about love that transcended the boundaries of biology and physics. The armor hummed softly, and Marcus realized that somewhere between repairing traumatized metal and falling in love with its royal owner, he had found exactly the kind of impossible, impractical, and absolutely perfect solution that made human engineering legendary throughout the galaxy.